We would later find, as many of you have heard, in examining the computer in the Anthony home, that there were searches for how to make chloroform. What does that mean? How was it made? We don't know. But again, forensic science cases are the art of the possible. You look at what you have, what you can examine, and what does it tell you. This is how we first got involved in this, how I first got involved in the case, was because of this new science, because it is very rare to have had the experience even once in your life to offer novel science in court, and I was lucky enough to have done it twice. The case became even more interesting, though, when Kaylee's body was found, which was about 6 months after the investigation began. The reason that was so fascinating is because we tried to take that scene and see what it could tell us, and it told us a lot. What we found was the skull of a child, and I'm sorry this is disturbing, but this is important to what we're talking about. We found the skull of a child with duct tape wrapped from basically the right jawbone across the face to the left. 3 pieces of duct tape over the face. We found the bones were scattered in various locations in this about a 30 square foot area, a 30 by 30 area where the bones had been scattered. The bones had certain levels of damage on them. What we tried to figure out from the scene was what happened to Kaylee and when did it happen? Because remember, at the time that we were first finding the body, the story was that this child had been taken from her mother sometime in the middle of the summer and may have been alive well into the fall. At least that's what the defense was saying. So it was important to us to explore this particular scene to say, what did it tell us? That scene was examined by, let's see, we had latent print examiners examining over 300 pieces of black plastic. Now, remember, the unique thing about forensic examinations is even when you virtually know you're not going to find anything, you still have to look. And this was a classic example of that. We had over 300 little pieces of black plastic bag. Now, we all knew that there wouldn't be any fingerprints on pieces of black plastic bag that had been out in the underwater in a scene for 6 months. They're just not going to be there. But we had an analyst at the FBI spend 6 months examining every single piece, just so that no one could say that we'd left any stone unturned. And as we suspected, there was nothing on them. We found duct tape that was on Kaylee's face. Again, it's been out there for 6 months. It was mostly deteriorated. You know, the tape, the plastic part had pulled away from the fiber part. The fibers were even partially degraded. The glue was pretty much gone. No way there was going to be fingerprints or DNA on any of those things after that long. But we checked it anyway. And unfortunately, you may remember, we found contamination. One of the FBI analysts had accidentally, despite all precautions, contaminated one of the pieces. It wasn't a big deal, but we did deal with it. What was most interesting to me was trying to figure out the answer of when. Because to me, that was the most important issue in the case, at least initially, was when. How long had Kaylee's body been at that scene? And we used a number of different specialties to answer that question. The first one was forensic pathology. Dr. G, our medical examiner, who happens to have her own TV show some of you may have seen, was instrumental in examining those bones, telling us what they could tell us. Unfortunately, the bones couldn't tell us much. All she could say was this was an apparently healthy child with no evidence of trauma. There's no reason based on the bones of why she's dead. We even went to the extreme, and again, the idea of sort of looking for things even though you know they're not there, is we brought in Dr. Goldberger to examine the skull to see if there was any evidence of any kind of chemicals that could have been used to knock her out, or any chronic use of chemicals. I mean, we all knew there wouldn't be anything there. These bones had been flooded, washed, baked over 6 months. We knew it wouldn't be there. But yet, we brought in Dr. Goldberger, came down and looked at it and came back and said, nope, there's nothing there, as we suspected. But we still checked. The most interesting part about this was the forensic anthropology to me. We brought in a forensic anthropologist who is a consultant for our medical examiner, Dr. John Schultz. He works at the University of Central Florida down in Orlando, to tell us what the distribution of the bones meant. And it was fascinating to me what he was able to tell us, because he was able to tell us that the distribution of the bones in various areas indicated that her body had been, and again, I apologize if anyone is bothered by this, but that her body had been moved, or parts had been moved by animals. Basically, we found the rib cage all in one place, as if the body, that part had been moved by an animal. We then found the spinal cord in another area, and it was basically all a pattern of how the body decomposes. I learned so much about how the human body decomposes after death through this case, and it is truly fascinating to those that are interested. The most fascinating part of this case that I explored but didn't find was this. And if anyone out there is a student thinking of wondering what to study for their PhD and something having to do with decomposition, this is one to do. One of the things we found that fascinated me was the shirt that Kaylee had been wearing was a cotton shirt, kind of thing you would buy at any department store, with lettering on it. And in a sort of an amazingly ironic part of the case, it said, "Big trouble comes in small packages." And all we found of the shirt was the letters. The cotton shirt itself had completely disintegrated. It had rotted away. And when I saw that, I was like, that ought to tell us something. I mean, wouldn't you think that somebody out there would have studied cloth and how it deteriorates at what rates? No, they haven't. It's fascinating, but they haven't. That was one area that I really wish that people had explored, the science had explored more. And again, that's an idea. Somebody has the idea of saying, hey, I wonder if we can get some scientific certainty to how cloth decomposes. Actually, there's only one study, I think it was out of FSU in 1988, that looked at that. But anyway, so the idea was to take any kind of scientific discipline we could find and apply it to this evidence. We applied forensic anthropology, anthropology, pathology, toxicology. We applied fingerprint, DNA, geology. We even had people examining shoes from Casey Anthony's house on the bizarre chance they might find some dirt in their shoes that was the same as the scene, even though it was 30 days later. We looked at everything we could possibly find to try and bring in some scientific connection between the evidence and Casey Anthony. One interesting thing we did do, which didn't come out in the trial, and I don't think anyone's ever done this before, but we actually used hydrology in this case. One of the things we were trying to do was, the area where Kaylee's body was found was a swampy area that was, by report of people who lived nearby, sometimes underwater. In fact, that was a big issue in the case at one point, was whether people had searched this area or not. So we actually went out, and I went out and found a hydrologist at the University of Florida, go Gators. And I said, is there any way that you can tell me when this area was underwater? Because, and again, as a consumer of forensic science, you don't have to actually know the science, but you just have to kind of have an idea of what's possible. And I thought to myself, well, water levels should be predictable, so someone should be able to tell me when this was underwater. Sure enough, we got a hydrologist from the University of Florida who did a 4 or 5 month study of this area, and he was actually able to go back and project based on water levels in a certain river to say this would have been underwater during these periods of time. The key to all of this massive study was basically to determine, was her body connected to this house, and 2, when did it get there? The beauty of it was that we were effectively able to establish that her remains came from the house, or were connected to the house. Everything found at the scene, we were able to connect either forensically or just by identification back to the house. And we were also able to establish through both the hydrology and the forensic anthropology and forensic entomology and all the other sciences we could use to establish that that body had to have been there for at least 6 months, which is the time frame from when Kaylee was last seen to when her body was found. The effect of all this, as you know, was that the defendant's story changed to say, okay, you're right. She did die at the house, and she did die in June. So here's my new story, and we all know the history of that. It was a fascinating case. Beauty of being a consumer of forensic science is that you don't have to know the science itself. I will never know as much about forensic toxicology as Dr. Goldberger, or as much as about hydrology as our hydrologist or any of the other specialists we had. But as an attorney, the important thing is to know just enough to understand how all of these various forensic disciplines fit together. And I think that's the important thing about being a lawyer and a consumer of forensic science, is to understand what's possible in forensic science and also how all the disciplines fit together to tell a story. Because ultimately, as a lawyer, that's what you're doing. You're trying to tell a story. You're telling the story through the evidence and through the scientific evaluation of the evidence. Thank you. Thank you all. We'll take questions later.